Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another video. Now on this video we're going to be talking about force and Newton's second law. Remember, when I posted the video on space, time and motion, when I finished I mentioned that I'm going to post a video on force and Newton's second law. This is the video. If you did not watch the video on space, time and motion, you might regret a bit. You need to watch the video because the content I'm going to be covering in this video has grounding in the form of video on space, time and motion. Okay, now what is force? What is force? What do you think about when we say force? Now, on the board I've written, it is the entity responsible for motion. What do I mean? What I mean is, whenever you see an object in motion, there is a force that was responsible for that motion. The body might not necessarily be experiencing a force at that very moment, say it's moving with a constant velocity. It may not necessarily be experiencing a force, but for it to get to the velocity it's moving at, it had to experience a force. So that is why I say it is the entity responsible for motion. Without a force, we have no motion. Without a force, we cannot get any motion. Now, what is motion? Again, I've written, motion is the translation or movement of a body or mass from one point in space to another. Now, when I say body or mass, I'm not trying to differentiate the two. I'm not saying the two are different. No, mass I say because we can distinguish bodies as quantity of matter. That's why I'm using the word mass. Body, this is just a common word in physics to describe a mass. So these two just mean the same thing. Okay, let's get into the details. Let's get into details of what is force really, like visually, mathematically, and Newton's second law. What does it have to do with force? Let's get into the details. Let me rub this. Okay, I might have said a force is an entity responsible for motion, but some people might not really get it, like what do we really mean when we say a force? Now, I'm going to be presenting a couple of illustrations that are going to help you really get it through your head, get it inside your brain, like really drill it in. So I hope this is going to be helpful. Now, let me start by making this clear. Okay. Now, there is one thing a lot of people do not take in mind about force. We usually see questions that may say we have a force F of 100 newtons. But people do not bear in mind, people do not like really regurgitate or think about. People do not think about where the 100 newton, where this value came from. Now, force is not something, like as an entity, force as an entity is not something we can measure directly. I'll repeat, force as an entity is not something we can measure directly. A lot of people think that, oh, we just take a force meter and we measure force. So, like we're measuring force like directly. No. We cannot measure force as an entity. Why? Number one, we cannot even see it, which is the number one and only reason. We cannot see force. We can only perceive its effects, but we cannot see force. This is the number one idea. If you want to understand Newton's second law, you have to appreciate that we cannot see force. Thereby, we cannot measure it directly. What then can we measure? What then would we be measuring when we say we've got a force of 100 newtons? What we are measuring is the effect of force. So what am I saying? Force is a cause. What we measure is the effect. Remember, cause and effect. Force is a cause. What does force cause? Force causes motion. Now, it is the effect of motion that we then measure to account for the existence of a force. it is the effect of motion that we then measure to account for the existence of a force. We cannot measure the force directly itself. Now, okay, let me write this, okay? I want us to quickly look at Newton's second law in mathematical form. Now, I know a lot of people might prefer this format, this format. I'm not going to use this. I'm going to use this. If you really want to understand Newton's second law, I'm going to play with this. Now, this you understand later, but I'm going to play with this. I might not talk about this in this video, but you'll definitely understand it later. And forget the fancy arrows. I'm not putting any fancy arrows. I do not want to intimidate anyone or get anyone confused. I'm just going to write it in this scalar form. Okay, this is Newton's second law. Force is equal to the product of mass and acceleration. Now remember, we said we cannot measure force. Remember, we cannot measure force directly. Let me not say we cannot measure force. We cannot measure force directly. Can we measure mass? Yes. Can we measure acceleration? Yes. Can we measure force? No. We cannot measure force. So what does Newton's second law then tell us? Newton's second law defines force for us so that we are able to measure it directly. Force itself we can never measure directly, but what we then do with Newton's second law, we talk about the effects the force produces. We then measure the effects, and then we say these effects are proportional to a certain force that was responsible for those effects. And the measurements we get pertaining to those effects are what we attribute or are what we assign to be the values of the force. That is how we get to measure force. That is how we get to measure force. It is not like you are measuring it directly. We are measuring it indirectly via measuring the effects. These are the effects. I'll explain. These are the effects. This is the cause. And you cannot measure this directly, like I said. We measure the effects and assume that the effects are proportional to the cause. Now this makes sense. You might be like, okay, that's a very, very huge assumption. What if the cause is not proportional to the effects? I'll show you that the assumption makes sense. The assumption makes sense to such an extent that for any cause and effect, the cause is always proportional to the effect. That I'll explain later. What I wanted to drill in your mind is, we cannot measure force directly. We can only measure its effects. And then because we believe that the effects are proportional to the cause, we then say the value we get when we measure the effect is equal to the value of the cause. Okay, let me explain further. Now, we have to talk about mass. A lot of people think they understand mass as it is used in Newton's second law, but they may be taking it for granted. Now, Newton's second law, although we're used to this, if we have a single mass, like a single point mass, Newton's second law is simply this. This is what I want you to think about. Do not think about this. Think about this. You want Newton's second law to be easy for you. You want Newton's second law to be easy for you to digest. You want it to be easy for you to digest. You better think of it in this way, not in this way. Let me explain. Let me give you an example. Say we've got a line in space and we've got a single mass. Remember, mass is the quantity of matter So say this is a single matter, meaning that m is equal to 1. Single matter. I usually label this as constituent particle. Let me just label it that way. Constituent particle. I label it this way. Now remember what I said. If you did not watch the video on space, time and motion, you might not completely get what I'm going to be presenting in this video. Okay, say we introduce our force. We exert a force F. Let me rub this. We've got our constituent particle or our single mass. Say we apply a force F. Now remember, in our previous video, we showed that time flows discretely. So this is a timeline. Timeline. And say we use this as our reference point. Now, when we apply a force, remember again, another thing to keep in mind, length, space. We said when motion is occurring, it occurs discretely. So we've got time, which flows discretely, and we've got motion, which occurs discretely. Let me explain now. We apply a force F. Now the force F, for every force, now begin to really listen. This is very important. For every force we apply, F, there is an accompanying velocity it produces on the mass it has been applied to. For example, let's say this force F, let's call it F1, produces in this constituent particle a velocity v1. It might be, say, 2 meters. Okay, I call this part time. Those are my units for time. And I call my units for length part length. I do not choose seconds and meters. That's just my preference. So my units are part time here, part length. Use meters or seconds. That's okay. You can just put your info on my info. You can just like project it on my units. Okay, so we're saying if I apply a single force F1, this force corresponds to a certain velocity. This force produces a single unique velocity in this constituent particle, and this is the velocity we're calling v1. So for example, it might be 2 parts per watt, 2 part length per part time, or if you want, you can just think about this as 2 meters per second. You can think of the velocity as 2 meters per second. So if you apply F1, it produces a speed or a velocity. Let me use a velocity. I might confuse a lot of people when I say speed. It produces a velocity of 2 meters per second in this constituent particle. But in what time duration? Now, let's come here. This is our reference point. Say when the body is here, when the body is here in relation to time, we have not yet applied our force. The following instant in time that follows is this one. There's nothing in between. These are like the smallest basic units of time. These are like the smallest units of time possible. So the following unit is here. That's when Fa comes in. That's when I apply my force Fa. When the particle is here in terms of time. That's when I introduce my force Fa. What does Fa do? Remember again, I said space is discrete. So let's say this is space right here. 2 part length per part time, or 2 meters per second. The moment I apply the force F1, this body moves 2 meters in 1 second, or 2 part lengths in 1 part time. this is 1 part time, and this is 1 part length. So we're going to go 1, 2. So when I apply a force of F1, the body is going to get to this point. Remember I said motion is an act of disappearances. So the body is going to appear at this point. What happens the other instant? The third instant. Again. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, the following instant, if I continue applying my force F1, in the third instant, remember when I applied my force, the body got a speed of 2 meters per second. 2 meters per second. If I continue applying my force F1, because F1 is responsible for producing a velocity of V1, what it's going to do is it's going to add upon the velocity produced previously. Previously, it produced a velocity of 2. Now, in the following instant, again, it's going to produce a velocity of 2, but the velocity it produced last time didn't disappear. So it's simply going to add upon that velocity. So it's going to go 1, 2, 3, 4 spaces in time. And again, if I apply it at this point in time, again, what does this mean? It means I have not yet removed the force F1. I'm applying it continuously, if you will, but I prefer to say discretely. I'm applying it discretely. So, in this instance of time, the force wasn't available. The body was just standing still. In this instance of time, the body has moved 2 parts in space. 2 parts. That's why I wrote 2 part length per part time. Part time is just a single unit of time. Then again, the body is now moving at 2 parts per part, 2 part length per part time, or at 2 meters per second. You can use 2 meters per second just to make things clear for you, but it's not very, very effective. You understand later. So the body is moving. It hasn't lost its velocity. I introduce again F1. What happens? Because F1 corresponds to the velocity V1, it doesn't produce any other velocity besides V1. What happens? The body previously had a velocity of 2. We add 2, now we've got 4. It moves 4 parts in space. We produce F1 again. What happens? The body is now moving at 4 part lengths per part time. And the force is responsible for what? 2 part lengths per part time. So we're going to have 4 plus 2. So meaning after this point, the body is going to move 6 parts. As we go further, it's going to move 8 parts. As we go further, it's going to move 10 parts, and so on, and so on, and so on. So as long as I keep exerting the force F1, because F1 is associated with a single velocity. What do I mean when I say F1 is associated with a single velocity V1? What I mean is F1 produces, like remember I said force is the entity that causes motion. When I say F1 is associated with V1, F1 is the force that is responsible for producing a motion of 2 part lengths per part time. In other words, a motion of 2 part length in a single instant. There is no other force responsible for producing this velocity. This is the only force responsible for producing this velocity. If you wanted to produce another velocity, say 3 meters per second, there is a single force associated with 3 meters per second. You want 7 meters per second, there is a single force associated with 7 meters per second. So if, for example, we applied F1 in the second instant, right? And the body begins to move at, say, 2 meters per second. And then we apply a force which corresponds to 3 meters per second. What happens? It adds upon that velocity. So we get 2 plus 3, 5 meters per second. Meaning when we get here, because we now have, let's call it F3. We now have F3 instead of F1. Our body at this point will be moving at 5 meters per second. And if on this point we remove the forces, the body will continue moving at that same velocity of 5 meters per second, which is Newton's first law. We won't be talking about Newton's first law. We just assume that a lot of people know Newton's first law. But if you do not know Newton's first law, let me know. I'll make a video on that. But basically it will be short. I do not have much to say about Newton's first law. But basically it's, for those who do not know, Newton's first law says, if a body is standing still, or if a body is still, or generally a body will continue in its state of rest or linear motion unless some kind of disturbance or external force acts on the body. It will continue in its state. If the state was linear motion, it will continue in that way. If the state was rest, it will continue that way. If a body is curving, then something is happening. There has to be an external force. That's what Newton's first law says in general. But if you want me to make an entire video on that, let me know. Okay, let's continue. So, notice something now. I said F1 is associated with V1. But if you're really paying attention, you'll notice that what I'm calling V1 is really the acceleration when it comes to our Newton's second law. Sorry, it's really the acceleration when you come to Newton's second law. What I'm calling the velocity is actually the acceleration. Yes, I know I might have confused you a bit. Let me explain. So you'll notice that V1 is really just the acceleration. Now, let me come to that point I spoke about us not being able to measure our force directly and how we have to, in fact, measure the effect of the motion so that we come up with the value for F. Remember, I said cause and effect are directly proportional. So, if we see a body, say we do not know, of course we do not know the force that's acting on the body exactly. Say we just see our body, we'll call it, okay, we already have a value for this. Okay, now let me explain the idea of cause and effect and how we are able to measure force despite not being able to measure it directly, despite not being able to see it. Let me explain how we measure force. So what happens is, what we know about force, despite being unable to measure it directly, what we know about force is force causes motion. So if we zoom in on the micro scale, what happens is this. If a body moves from, say, this point, like I was explaining, it moves from this point to this point, we know that there is a force responsible. That we know for a fact. For a body cannot just move. There has to be an external force responsible. According to Newton's first law, there has to be an external force responsible because the rest state has been disturbed. So when a body moves from this point to this point, or from this point to this point, what we know firstly is that there has to be a force responsible. Now, what we then do, how do we then measure F1? How then do we come up with the values for F? What we say is, this is space. Remember I said space is discrete. Now, this body has moved two parts in space. 1, 2, or 1, 2, if you will. This body has moved two parts in space. What we then say, we do not determine this we do not determine Newton's second law by experiment. We determine Newton's second law by close reasoning. What we then say is, because it has moved two parts in space, I'll repeat, because it has moved two parts in space, there is a certain force, which we say, all right, let me do this. There is a certain force, F1, which is responsible for moving the body two parts in space. That's literally how we do it. Because the body moved two parts in space, and we know that there is a force responsible for that. What we then say, how then do we define the force responsible for that? We say the force responsible for this motion is the force that causes the body to move two parts in space. If the body had moved three parts in space, we would then say the force that caused the body to move 3 parts in space is, say, let's call it, let's say this is F2 for 2 parts in space, just for now. We would call F3 the body that the force that causes the body to move 3 parts in space. That is 1, 2, 3 up to this point. So if the body had moved from this point to this point, we would say this motion was caused by a certain force F3. I repeat, we would say this motion was caused by a certain force F3, which is different from the force F2, which causes the body to move 2 parts in space. Why do we say F2 and F3 are different? We say F2 and F3 are different because of the positions the ball reaches. These 2 positions are different, and hence F2 and F3 have to be different. Why? Because F2 is the one responsible for this motion, and F3 is the one responsible for this motion. Since the motions or the distances traversed are not the same, we then conclude that F2 and F3 must not be the same, and F3 has to be greater than F2 because the body moved a greater distance. So whatever force caused the body to move 3 parts in space has to be greater than F2 because F2 only caused the body to move 2 parts in space, which is less than 3 parts in space. So that's basically how we do it. So what we then do is we take a ruler and we put it here and we measure. Okay, 1, 2, 3. F3 caused our body to move 3 parts in space. And if these were meters, we would say, for example, F3 caused our body to move 3 meters. Now, this happens in a single instant. This happens in a single instant in time or in a single unit of time. We'll say our body, F3 caused our body to move 3 meters. And now, listen to this. Listen to this. Because F3 caused our body to move 3 meters, the value of F3 becomes 3 meters. But we won't use the units meters. We use a different unit. Say, for example, I may say, okay, I want the units of force now to be called newtons. That's when we come and say 3 newtons. So 3 newtons is the force that is responsible for 3 meters. I'll repeat, 3 newtons is the force that is responsible for moving our body 3 meters in space. Now again, I said I'm using part length. For me, that's the force responsible for using. Now part length is the smallest unit for length, and part time is the smallest unit for time. So 3 newtons is the force that would be responsible for moving our body 3 part lengths in space. That's how we measure. That's how we measure force. Now, what we might do is, because one might not necessarily want it to be so, because we know cause is proportional to effect, so we might introduce a constant of proportionality, if you will, and say, well, you know what? I do not want our value to be 3. I do not want the value of the force to be 3, just like the value of length. I want the value to be, say, 5. I want the value of the force that is responsible for this motion to be 5. So I want 5 Newton to be responsible for a motion of 3 meters. How then do I equate this in terms of equation? Now look at this. I say F is equals to ma, meaning that F is equals to ma, like these two things are equal. In this case, they are equal. Now, if I do this, I would have to introduce a constant of proportionality. So we'd have something like F is equals to K3. And what is K? K is equals to 3 over 5. So in this case, Newton's law becomes F is equal to 3/5A. But we do not do that. We do not do that. We simply use a one-to-one relation. A one-to-one relation. That's what we use. And hence, we find that we do not need to introduce a constant of proportionality as long as we're working with newtons. The moment someone says, okay, I'm using units different from those of newtons, like say, I'm using 5 noxes, and 1 newton is equals to 5 noxes, then we would need to use a constant of proportionality. But if we do not do that, if we continue using newtons, then we'll just use a one-to-one relationship. Now, how does the M come in now? It so happens that with bodies, we do not have a constituent particle. We have a lot of particles. A lot of particles. So there may be particles here and here and here and here and here and here and so forth, occupying the whole body. So what do we then do? Our force F2, we're going back to F2. Our force F2 won't just be acting on a single particle. It's now acting on, say, 10 particles. Our force F2 is now acting on, say, 10 particles. Now, mass is the quantity of matter. So how many metals do we have here? We've got 10. Now, because we have 10 metals, we have how many forces? 10 forces, or 10 F2s. So we've got 10 F2s. Is equal to what? Is equal to 10 velocities. Remember I said this is just the acceleration, or the displacement in a single instant, if you will. 10 F2s, 10 forces, because we've got 10 particles, or 10 metals. 10 F2 is equals to 10 velocities or displacements, whatever makes you sleep, 10 accelerations. That's okay. This we then call the net force, F. So we've got F is equal to 10A. But 10, remember, is the quantity of the matter, which we can represent by a letter M. Then we've got M is equal to MA. That is where F is equal to MA comes from. Remember, I say the best way to understand this is by first working with one particle and then working our way up to M, a lot of particles. So M is really a number that represents the quantity of these constituent particles involved. Do not let it scare you. It's just a number that represents the number of the constituent particles involved. That's all, ladies and gentlemen. That's all there is to force and Newton's second law. Force and Newton's second law. Not force in general, not Newton's second law in general. I shall be making more videos on force alone and Newton's second law alone. What exactly will the videos be talking about? They'll be looking at the implications of Newton's second law and the implications of measuring force according to Newton's second law. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Have a good time. If you like the video, please subscribe, leave a like and comment. It grows the channel. Stay motivated.